CIA cat spy. In the middle of the Cold War, paranoia could make even the smartest people believe in strange ideas, but few government projects were as bizarre or as real as the CIA's attempt to turn cats into spies. It began in the early 1960s, when American intelligence agencies were obsessed with eavesdropping on Soviet diplomats. The technology of the time was bulky, unreliable, and easy to detect. Somewhere in that pressure-filled environment, someone proposed a strange solution. What if a cat could do the job? It could walk near targets unnoticed, carrying a tiny listening device. Under a classified operation known as Acoustic Kitty, the CIA's Office of Technical Services surgically implanted microphones into a cat's ear canal, a transmitter at the base of its skull, and ran a thin wire through its fur. They trained the animal to approach people and sit quietly near them. The goal was to record conversations from park benches, embassy gardens, or anywhere diplomats might speak freely. The first mission was meant to be historic. The cat was released near the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C. Moments later, it was struck and killed by a taxi. The project had cost roughly $20 million. After years of testing and failure, the CIA quietly shut the program down. Official records, later declassified, confirmed that the idea had not only been real, it had been seriously funded and pursued. Today, Operation Acoustic Kitty is remembered as one of the strangest moments in espionage history. A story so ridiculous it sounds like satire, yet came straight from official U.S. intelligence files. It's a reminder that during the Cold War, even the most powerful agencies sometimes mistook desperation for innovation, and a living creature for a tool of war. The gay bomb. In 1994, deep inside a U.S. Air Force research lab in Ohio, scientists were asked to think creatively, perhaps too creatively, about how to win wars without killing anyone. What followed was one of the strangest official proposals in military history: a gay bomb. The document, obtained years later through the Freedom of Information Act, described a non-lethal chemical weapon that would alter the behavior of enemy soldiers. The idea was simple, at least on paper. Disperse powerful aphrodisiac chemicals over enemy positions to make soldiers sexually attracted to one another, disrupting unit cohesion and morale. The memo explained that the weapon could cause widespread homosexual behavior and therefore embarrass enemy personnel. It wasn't satire, it wasn't a hoax. The proposal came from the Air Force's Wright Laboratory, which was seriously exploring unconventional psychochemical weapons, substances designed to confuse, disorient, or humiliate rather than kill. Alongside the so-called gay bomb were ideas for bad breath bombs and chemicals to attract swarms of angry wasps toward targets. When the plan was revealed in 2005 by the Sunshine Project, a watchdog group, it sparked disbelief and ridicule. Yet the documents were authentic. They showed that the military had formally requested $7.5 million to develop these love chemicals, viewing them as potential tools of psychological warfare. Of course, the project never left the planning stage. No such bomb was ever built or tested, and the notion of using pheromones to manipulate human attraction was scientifically absurd. Still, it happened, on official letterhead, paid for by real tax dollars. In the long history of military innovation, the gay bomb remains a quiet emblem of Cold War absurdity, proof that when fear and imagination collide, even the world's most powerful armies can dream up weapons that belong more in comedy than combat. North Korea kidnapped Japanese. For years, it sounded like the kind of rumor people whispered on dark corners of the coast. Stories of Japanese citizens who vanished without a trace. supposedly kidnapped by North Korean agents. It was too strange, too cinematic to be true, until it was. The disappearances began quietly in the late 1970s. Young couples, students, and even teenagers went missing along Japan's western shores. Police reports offered no answers. Some families suspected foul play. Others believed their loved ones had run away. But as the cases multiplied, a strange pattern emerged. Nearly all had vanished near the Sea of Japan, directly across from North Korea. By the 1980s, whispers of abductions had become a public theory. North Korea denied everything, calling it slander. Still, the stories persisted. Former fishermen in Japan claimed to have seen suspicious vessels at night. In South Korea, defectors told journalists that Japan's missing citizens were being held in secret compounds, teaching North Korean spies Japanese language and customs so they could pass as locals. For decades, Tokyo demanded answers, but Pyongyang said nothing. Then, in 2002, something unimaginable happened. North Korea's leader, Kim Jong-il, publicly admitted that his country had indeed kidnapped Japanese citizens. They had been used to train spies. The revelation stunned the world. North Korea confirmed 13 abductions, though Japan insists there were many more, possibly over 100. Some victims were eventually returned home. Others were reported dead, their remains inconsistently identified, their families left in doubt. What began as an unbelievable conspiracy turned out to be one of the most haunting acts of Cold War espionage. In the end, the truth was simple and devastating. An entire government had stolen people, not for ransom or politics, but for language lessons. Project Sunshine. It began with a question scientists couldn't easily answer. How much radioactive fallout was settling inside the human body? After the atomic bomb tests of the 1950s, the United States wanted numbers, hard data. But what they did to get it would remain one of the most unsettling scientific secrets of the Cold War. The program was called Project Sunshine, a government study launched in 1953 to measure the spread of radioactive isotopes, particularly strontium-90, around the world. These isotopes, released by nuclear explosions, were known to accumulate in human bone. To track their movement, scientists needed samples, thousands of them, and soon they began collecting them without consent. The project gathered bone and tissue from the dead, often infants and children, in countries from Australia to the United Kingdom. Hospitals, morgues, and even funeral homes provided samples, sometimes quietly, sometimes unknowingly. Parents were rarely told. In one account, a British mother learned years later that her baby's legs had been removed after stillbirth, taken for research. She had never been allowed to dress the child for burial. For years, Project Sunshine operated quietly, its data fueling nuclear safety models and fallout maps. The truth came to light only in the mid-1950s, when a leaked transcript revealed scientists discussing the need for more baby samples. The reaction was swift and horrified. Governments scrambled to explain. What makes Project Sunshine so haunting isn't just the secrecy, it's the intent behind it. Scientists weren't trying to harm anyone. They were trying to understand how radiation spread through life itself. But in their pursuit of knowledge, they crossed a line that can't be measured in data, proving that even in science, morality can be the first casualty of fear. CIA ran secret brothels. It started with a theory that sounded too strange to be true, that the CIA once ran brothels where unsuspecting men were secretly drugged with LSD. Years later, it turned out to be exactly what happened. In the 1950s, the US government became obsessed with the idea of controlling the human mind. This was the height of the Cold War, and intelligence agencies feared that the Soviets or Chinese might have already discovered methods of brainwashing. The CIA's answer was a sprawling secret project known as MK Ultra, a series of psychological experiments that tested drugs, hypnosis, and sensory manipulation on both volunteers and unknowing civilians. One of the most bizarre branches of this program was Operation Midnight Climax. In 1955, the CIA rented apartments in San Francisco and New York and converted them into safe houses disguised as brothels. Prostitutes on the agency's payroll would lure men back, where the drinks were secretly laced with LSD. Behind one-way mirrors, CIA operatives watched and took notes, studying how the men reacted to the drug and how their behavior changed under the influence. The entire operation was filmed and recorded. No one involved, except the prostitutes and the agents, knew it was an experiment. The data collected was chaotic and largely useless, but the program continued for years, all under the direction of a man named George White, a federal narcotics officer working for the CIA. When MK Ultra was exposed in the 1970s, the revelations stunned the public. The notion that a government agency had literally created its own brothels for mind control research sounded like fiction. But the documents were real. In a time defined by fear and secrecy, Midnight Climax revealed something unsettling: that the line between science and madness can blur easily when no one is watching. Nestle's baby formula scandal. A mother in a rural village opens a small tin of powdered milk. On the label, a healthy baby smiles beneath the Nestle logo, a picture of trust, of progress. She mixes the powder with water, believing she's giving her child the same start as any baby in the modern world. What she doesn't know is that the very formula meant to nourish has set off one of the most infamous corporate scandals in history. During the 1970s, Nestle launched an aggressive campaign across Africa, Asia, and Latin America to promote baby formula as a modern, superior alternative to breastfeeding. Dressed in nurses' uniforms, company saleswomen visited hospitals and maternity wards, handing out free samples and assuring mothers that formula was cleaner, safer, and more scientific. At first, the strategy worked. Mothers trusted the brand and the medical-looking representatives. But when the free samples ran out, families had to buy the expensive formula themselves. And to make it last, many diluted it. Worse still, much of the water used to mix the powder was contaminated, leading to deadly infections and malnutrition. Health experts began to notice patterns: soaring infant mortality rates in regions where formula use had spread. By the late 1970s, activists and doctors accused Nestlé of exploiting poor mothers and misleading them into abandoning breastfeeding, the single safest form of infant nutrition. The outrage grew into an international boycott that spread through the 1980s and beyond. Nestlé denied wrongdoing, but eventually agreed to follow new global marketing standards. The scandal became a case study in corporate ethics, or the lack of it. Nestlé sold trust in a can, and millions believed it. But behind that smiling baby was a bitter truth. Profit had been mistaken for progress. Operation Gladio. A bomb explodes in a crowded Italian train station. Dozens die. Panic spreads. The newspapers blame communists, and the government vows to restore order. But years later, investigators uncover something disturbing. The attack wasn't the work of left-wing radicals at all. It was part of a secret Western intelligence network, quietly shaping Europe from the shadows. Its name was Operation Gladio. After World War II, the United States and NATO feared a Soviet invasion of Western Europe. To prepare, they created secret, stay-behind armies, resistance networks that could fight behind enemy lines if the Soviets ever invaded. These networks were hidden in plain sight, armed with weapons caches, radio systems, and quiet cooperation from Western intelligence agencies. But as the Cold War dragged on, the mission evolved. In countries like Italy, Belgium, and Turkey, Gladio operatives didn't just prepare for invasion, they allegedly began influencing politics. According to later investigations, some members collaborated with far-right extremists, staging false flag attacks meant to discredit leftist movements and push the public toward conservative governments. In Italy alone, a series of bombings during the 1970s, including the 1980 Bologna massacre, were linked to Gladio's clandestine network. When the Italian Prime Minister finally revealed its existence in 1990, the country was stunned. NATO confirmed stay-behind operations had existed, but denied involvement in terrorism. Parliaments across Europe launched inquiries. Documents were destroyed, testimonies redacted, and key figures vanished into silence. To this day, no complete record of Operation Gladio has ever been made public. What began as a defense plan against communism became something much darker. A secret war fought within democracy itself. For decades, the fear of losing freedom led Western governments to quietly compromise it, and the echoes of Gladio still linger in the shadows of Europe's history. U.S. government poisoned alcohol. During the 1920s, the United States tried to make an entire country sober by force. It didn't work. People kept drinking, only now they were breaking the law to do it. But what few realized at the time was that the government's frustration with bootleggers would lead to one of the deadliest social experiments in American history. When Prohibition began in 1920, alcohol was banned, but industrial alcohol, the kind used in factories, cleaning products, and fuel, was still legal. Criminals discovered they could steal, redistill, and sell it as drinkable liquor. In response, the US government took a drastic step. It ordered manufacturers to add toxic chemicals like methyl alcohol, kerosene, and chloroform to make the supply undrinkable. The plan was simple: poison the product, stop the drinking. But people kept drinking anyway. Bootleggers rarely removed the toxins, and many didn't care. By 1926, hospital wards in New York were overflowing with victims of poisoned liquor. Some went blind. Others died in agony. That year alone, more than 700 New Yorkers were killed by tainted alcohol. Nationwide, the toll climbed into the thousands. The policy, quietly approved by the US Treasury Department, continued for years. Officials defended it as a necessary deterrent. Critics called it government murder. The New York City medical examiner at the time, Charles Norris, publicly condemned the program, saying, "The government knows it is poisoning drinkers, yet it continues." When Prohibition ended in 1933, the poisoning stopped, but the legacy lingered, a moral crusade that had crossed a terrible line. In trying to save the country from alcohol, the government ended up killing the very people it claimed to protect. A century later, it remains one of the darkest and most absurd chapters in America's war on vice. It was the early 1980s, a time of medical breakthroughs and a time of fear. HIV had only just been discovered, and doctors were struggling to understand how it spread. But one company, trusted around the world, would soon become the center of one of the most horrifying medical scandals in modern history. Bayer, a pharmaceutical giant, was producing a life-saving product called Factor VIII, a clotting agent used by people with haemophilia. The treatment was made from pooled human blood, thousands of donations mixed together before being processed. At the time, there was no test for HIV. When the virus entered the blood supply, it spread quickly through products like this one. By 1984, scientists and regulators knew the risk. Bayer developed a new heat-treated version of Factor VIII that killed the virus. But there was a problem. The company still had large stocks of the old, untreated medicine. Instead of destroying it, internal memos later revealed that Bayer's subsidiary Cutter Biological continued selling the older product overseas, to Asia and Latin America, even after pulling it from the US market. Thousands of patients were infected. In Japan, Hong Kong, France, and Argentina, families began noticing the same pattern. Young haemophiliacs suddenly testing positive for HIV. Lawsuits and investigations followed. Bayer eventually paid settlements but never admitted wrongdoing, insisting it had followed the standards of the time. The scandal became public in the 1990s, when declassified documents confirmed what many feared. Profit had been placed above lives. For a company known for aspirin, the revelation was surreal, a symbol of how corporate caution can become corporate cruelty. In medicine, mistakes can cost lives. But in this case, the mistake wasn't in science, it was in conscience. The monster study. In 1939, inside a quiet orphanage in Davenport, Iowa, a group of children sat across from researchers who told them how they spoke was wrong. Their voices trembled, their confidence faded, and over time, many began to stutter. What they didn't know was that they were the subjects of a secret psychological experiment. One so cruel that decades later, it would be called the monster study. It began with good intentions. Wendell Johnson, a speech pathologist at the University of Iowa, wanted to understand how stuttering developed. His theory was radical for the time, that stuttering wasn't born from physical defects, but from anxiety and negative reinforcement. To test it, his graduate student Mary Tudor carried out an experiment that crossed every ethical line imaginable. 22 orphan children were split into groups. Half were praised for their speech, told they were strong, articulate, and intelligent. The others were told the opposite, that their speech was poor, their voices broken, their words flawed. None of the children had stuttered before. But soon, the verbal abuse took effect. They became withdrawn, anxious, and afraid to speak. Some never recovered. The study was never published at the time. Johnson feared backlash, and Tudor herself later called it a mistake. For decades, it remained hidden in university archives until journalists uncovered it in 2001. Survivors described the emotional scars they carried, and the state of Iowa eventually settled lawsuits brought by some of the victims. What makes the monster study so haunting isn't just its cruelty, it's how close it came to proving its own dark thesis. The experiment designed to show that fear can create a stutter ended up creating fear itself. In trying to cure speech, they broke silence and left it echoing for a lifetime. Operation Northwoods, a polished conference table, an American flag, and a stack of documents stamped top secret. Somewhere in the Pentagon, 1962. A group of generals sits in silence as a plan is presented, one that would frame their own country for acts of terror. The name on the folder reads, Operation Northwoods. It was a time when paranoia ruled policy. The Soviet Union had aligned with Fidel Castro's Cuba, and the US military was desperate to remove him from power. Diplomatic pressure hadn't worked. So the Joint Chiefs of Staff proposed something drastic, a blueprint to trick the American public into supporting war. The plan outlined a series of staged events designed to look like Cuban aggression. US ships could be blown up in the Caribbean. Passenger planes could be hijacked or destroyed and blamed on Cuban forces. Even fabricated funerals and fake news stories were considered. The objective was clear: create outrage, then use it to justify an invasion. Every detail was meticulously planned. The only thing missing was approval. When the proposal reached Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara and President John F. Kennedy, they refused to authorize it. Kennedy, by some accounts, was disturbed by how calmly his generals had discussed attacking their own citizens. For decades, the plan remained hidden, whispered about in conspiracy circles, dismissed as impossible. Then, in the 1990s, declassified documents confirmed it was real. Operation Northwoods had been drafted, reviewed, and signed by top military leaders. It never happened, but it could have. The idea that a democratic government would consider manufacturing tragedy to start a war feels unthinkable. Yet there it was, written, approved, and filed away. Proof that sometimes the wildest conspiracies are simply the ones we were never meant to read. Operation Paperclip. The Second World War ended in 1945, but for the United States, another race had just begun. A race not for land or power, but for minds. Hidden behind the public celebration of victory was a secret operation that would bring hundreds of Nazi scientists to America. Its name sounded harmless: Operation Paperclip. At the war's end, Allied forces discovered vast troves of German research in rocketry, aeronautics, chemistry, and medicine, far beyond anything the West possessed. But many of the scientists behind these breakthroughs were members of the Nazi Party, some directly involved in war crimes. The US government faced a choice: punish them or use them. In 1945, President Truman authorized a classified program to recruit German scientists before the Soviets could. It was a Cold War logic: intelligence over ethics. The operation got its name from the paperclips attached to the scientists' files, marking those who were to be secretly approved despite their Nazi pasts. Among them was Werner von Braun, an SS officer and lead engineer of the V-2 rocket, a weapon that had rained down on London and killed thousands. Within a decade, he was living in Alabama, working for NASA's predecessor, and later became the chief architect of the Saturn V rocket that sent humans to the moon. More than 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and doctors were brought to the US under Paperclip. Their wartime affiliations were often rewritten, sanitized, or erased entirely. Many received citizenship, awards, and prestigious posts in government and industry. It's a story that blurs the line between victory and compromise. America didn't just defeat Nazism, it quietly absorbed part of it. Operation Paperclip remains one of history's strangest bargains, a deal where morality was traded for progress, and the past was literally paperclipped shut. The CIA trafficked drugs. A hot summer day in Los Angeles, 1984. Street corners hum with life. The music, the heat, the haze. But something else is spreading too. Something invisible at first. A new form of a dangerous substance. Within months, whole neighborhoods begin to unravel. The product is cheap, the supply endless. And quietly, a rumor starts to circulate that this isn't an accident at all. That someone, somewhere, is letting it happen. For years, that rumor lived on the edges of conversation. It was too unbelievable that the CIA America's own spy agency, could be connected to traffickers. But the trail didn't start in Los Angeles. It started thousands of miles away in the jungles of Central America. During the 1980s, the United States was secretly funding Nicaraguan rebel forces called the Contras, who were fighting a socialist government aligned with the Soviet Union. Congress had outlawed direct military support. So, to keep the operation alive, money had to come from somewhere else. Through weapons deals, and as later investigations revealed, through money from illegal trade. In 1996, journalist Gary Webb uncovered that traffickers tied to the Contras had smuggled large amounts of illegal substances into the US, fueling a public health crisis. The profits, he reported, were quietly funneled to fund the CIA-backed rebels. The agency denied it. Webb was discredited. His career never recovered. But 2 years later, a CIA Inspector General's report admitted what Webb had claimed. The agency knew its allies were involved in the trade and allowed it to continue. No grand conspiracy, no secret lab, just bureaucracy and silence, the kind that destroys lives without ever pulling a trigger. The CIA didn't sell the product. It just made sure the people who did could keep the war going. And for many Americans, that was betrayal enough. The fruit machine. During the Cold War, Canada became gripped by a strange kind of fear, not of bombs or spies, but of its own people. The government believed that homosexual employees posed a national security threat. The reasoning was simple and cruel. If someone hid their sexuality, foreign agents could blackmail them. And so, a mission began to find and remove them. At Carleton University in Ottawa, psychologist Dr. Frank Robert Wake was given the task. His idea would become one of the most absurd inventions in modern history, a device that could supposedly detect if someone was gay. It came to be known as the fruit machine. The machine worked by showing subjects erotic images, while sensors measured how their bodies reacted. A camera tracked the dilation of their pupils. Other instruments monitored their pulse, sweat, and breathing. The theory was that these tiny changes would expose hidden attraction. Civil servants, soldiers, and even students were tested. Many lost jobs, reputations, or security clearances based on the results of this so-called science. The irony, of course, is that the machine didn't actually work. The tests were unreliable, easily influenced by lighting, stress, or even embarrassment. But to those in power, it offered the illusion of certainty, and that was enough. When the truth eventually surfaced, it left behind a dark legacy. The fruit machine wasn't just a failed experiment. It was a symbol of how fear can dress itself as logic and how discrimination can hide behind the language of research. Years later, Canada apologized. But the story still lingers as a quiet warning. The moment a nation starts trying to measure identity with machines, it stops understanding what it means to be human. The US tested radiation on citizens, a hospital room, a clipboard, a patient who thinks they're getting better. That's how many of these stories began, quietly and without permission. From the 1940s through the 1970s, the US government conducted hundreds of secret radiation experiments on its own citizens. The goal was to study how radiation affected the human body, information deemed critical in the nuclear age. But the people being studied didn't know they were part of an experiment. They were soldiers, hospital patients, expectant mothers, and even children. At the height of the Cold War, fear drove science into moral grey zones. In one case, patients in hospitals were injected with plutonium and uranium to study how their bodies processed it. They were told it was treatment. At Vanderbilt University, pregnant women were given what they believed were vitamin drinks. In reality, the shakes contained radioactive iron. In Massachusetts, young boys at a school for the mentally disabled were fed oatmeal laced with radioactive traces under the guise of a nutrition program sponsored by a cereal company. Even entire neighborhoods were used. In cities like St. Louis, radioactive materials were secretly released into the air to study how fallout might spread in an attack. The people living there had no idea. For decades, these experiments remained buried in classified reports. It wasn't until the 1990s that declassified documents and whistleblower accounts revealed the truth. Public outrage followed, and in 1995, President Bill Clinton issued a formal apology to the victims and their families. The scientists said they were serving progress, protecting the nation, advancing knowledge. But what they left behind was a legacy of betrayal. It turned out the real danger of the nuclear age wasn't just the bomb itself. It was the quiet willingness to experiment with humanity in its shadow. The business plot. The year was 1933, and America was on its knees. The Great Depression had gutted the economy, leaving millions without work and faith in the government at an all-time low. Wall Street was furious at President Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal policies, which promised to rein in corporate power and redistribute wealth. Behind closed doors, some of the country's most influential businessmen began to whisper about taking matters into their own hands. That whisper grew into something darker, a plan to overthrow the President of the United States. The man chosen to lead this coup was Major General Smedley Butler, one of the most respected military figures in America. A tough, plain-spoken Marine with 2 Medals of Honor, Butler was approached by intermediaries claiming to represent a coalition of industrialists, bankers, and veterans groups. Their proposal was audacious: raise an army of 500,000 veterans, march on Washington, and restore order. Butler would act as the public face, while the real power, a group of wealthy elites, would operate behind him. But Butler wasn't the kind of man to betray his country. Instead, he reported everything to Congress. In 1934, he testified before the House Un-American Activities Committee, naming names and detailing the conspiracy. The investigation confirmed his story, at least in part, but no charges were ever filed. The government quietly downplayed the affair, and newspapers dismissed it as fantasy. Historians later dubbed it the business plot. Though it failed before it began, it revealed something chilling: that a group of America's richest men truly believed democracy could be replaced if they just found the right general. The Great Depression eventually passed, but the story lingered. A reminder that sometimes the real threat to democracy comes from the boardroom, not the battlefield. Operation Mockingbird, a newspaper on a breakfast table, a headline about politics, a photo from overseas. For most readers, it's just another day's news. But during the Cold War, not every story in the paper was written by journalists. Some were written by the CIA. The project had an innocent-sounding name: Operation Mockingbird. Its goal was to shape public opinion at home and abroad, using the most powerful tool available: the media. It began quietly in the late 1940s, when the newly formed CIA sought ways to spread pro-American ideas and counter Soviet influence. What started as small-scale propaganda soon evolved into one of the agency's most ambitious psychological operations. Declassified documents and later investigations revealed that the CIA had recruited hundreds of journalists, editors, and media executives around the world. Major outlets, from newspapers to radio stations to television networks, were infiltrated. Some reporters were paid directly. Others simply shared information or published stories written by CIA officers. In foreign countries, Mockingbird helped plant news favorable to US interests and discredit opposing views. The program ran for decades, so quietly that even some within the media didn't know it existed. It wasn't until the 1970s, when the Church Committee investigated US intelligence abuses, that Mockingbird's reach became public. The findings were stunning. Respected journalists had been writing propaganda under government direction. For many Americans, it shattered trust in the press. The very institution meant to hold power accountable. Operation Mockingbird wasn't about censorship. It was about influence, the subtle rewriting of truth. Today, the phrase is used loosely in conspiracy circles, often exaggerated. But the core remains real. Once, the world's most trusted newsrooms weren't just reporting the story, they were part of it. Operation Snow White. A typewriter clacks in a quiet government office. It's the 1970s, the age of Watergate, paranoia, and espionage. But this time, the spies aren't from Moscow or Washington. They're from the Church of Scientology. The operation they launched was called Operation Snow White, and by the time it was uncovered, it had become the largest known infiltration of the United States government in history, carried out not by a foreign enemy, but by a religious organization. At its core, Scientology believed the US government was conspiring against it. The church's founder, L. Ron Hubbard, claimed that federal agencies were spreading lies about Scientology, especially within the IRS, which refused to grant the church tax-exempt status. To fix that problem, Hubbard's followers decided to clean up those records, literally. Beginning in 1973, thousands of Scientologists were recruited for covert missions to infiltrate government offices, including the IRS, the Department of Justice, and even the CIA. Under fake identities, church members obtained jobs inside federal buildings, stole documents, forged credentials, and wiretapped phones. They broke into embassies, attorneys' offices, and press agencies, all in an effort to erase or steal files critical of Scientology. The plan worked for years, but in 1977, it unraveled. FBI agents raided Scientology offices in Los Angeles and Washington, uncovering more than 20,000 stolen government documents. 11 high-ranking Scientologists, including Hubbard's wife, Mary Sue Hubbard, were convicted of conspiracy and theft of government property. The church called it a misunderstanding. The FBI called it one of the boldest domestic espionage operations ever attempted. Operation Snow White remains a surreal story, a reminder that sometimes paranoia becomes prophecy. In trying to prove they were being watched, Scientology ensured they always would be. Cointelpro, a locked filing cabinet, a stack of letters, a government seal stamped across the top. To most people, they looked like routine paperwork, but to those who opened them, they revealed one of the darkest operations in FBI history, a program that spied on, harassed, and tried to destroy American citizens. It was called Cointelpro. The name stood for Counterintelligence Program, and it began quietly in 1956 under FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. Officially, its purpose was to monitor groups considered a threat to national security. In practice, it became something far more personal, a secret war on political dissent. The targets ranged widely: civil rights leaders, anti-war activists, black liberation movements, feminists, even musicians and journalists. The FBI used wiretaps, forged letters, blackmail, and planted rumors. They infiltrated organizations like the Black Panther Party, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and even Martin Luther King Jr. himself. Hoover saw King as a dangerous radical. In one infamous case, agents mailed him an anonymous letter urging him to take his own life, a psychological attack designed to break him. For years, these operations stayed hidden behind locked doors and sealed files. That changed in 1971, when a group of anti-war activists broke into an FBI office in Media, Pennsylvania. They stole classified documents and sent them to the press. Among them was the word Cointelpro. Public outrage followed. Congressional hearings confirmed the program's existence and revealed its scope. Decades of illegal surveillance, disinformation, and sabotage, all justified in the name of security. Cointelpro was officially shut down in 1971, but its shadow never disappeared. It's a reminder that the line between protection and persecution can blur easily, especially when a government starts treating its critics as enemies. The Tuskegee Syphilis study, a small town in Alabama, red dirt roads, wooden porches, and the promise of free medical care. For hundreds of poor black men living in Tuskegee in the 1930s, that promise seemed like a lifeline. What they didn't know was that it would become one of the most infamous betrayals in American history. In 1932, the U.S. Public Health Service launched what it called the Tuskegee Study of Untreated Syphilis in the Negro Male. The goal, according to officials, was to observe how syphilis progressed naturally in the human body. The subjects, about 600 men, mostly sharecroppers, were told they were receiving treatment for bad blood, a vague local term for various illnesses. In reality, they weren't being treated at all. Even after penicillin became a known and effective cure in the 1940s, the doctors withheld it. Instead, they continued the study, letting men die, go blind, or pass the disease to their wives and children. Autopsies were arranged in advance, all of it done in the name of science. The experiment continued for 40 years, hidden behind bureaucratic language and official forms. It wasn't until 1972, when a whistleblower leaked the story to the press, that the truth came out. The public was horrified. The study was shut down, lawsuits were filed, and the US government finally admitted its role. Decades later, President Bill Clinton issued a formal apology to the surviving participants and their families, calling it deeply, profoundly, morally wrong. The Tuskegee study wasn't a conspiracy theory. It was a conspiracy fact. An entire community had been used as lab subjects by their own government. What began as medical research ended as a warning. Sometimes, the most dangerous experiment is the one hidden behind the word trust. The US planned to nuke the moon. On a crisp night in the late 1950s, Americans looked up at the sky and saw something unsettling. A Soviet satellite gliding silently overhead. It was called Sputnik, and it wasn't just a machine. It was a message. The space race had begun, and the United States was already behind. In the halls of the US Air Force, panic met imagination. How could they prove American superiority in space? The answer, at least to some, was simple: blow up the moon. The plan was real. Codenamed Project A119, it was developed in secret in 1958 by the US Air Force in partnership with the Illinois Institute of Technology. The proposal called for detonating a nuclear bomb on the surface of the moon, not as a weapon, but as a demonstration. The flash, visible from Earth, would show the world that America's technology could reach anywhere, even the heavens. Scientists, including a young Carl Sagan, were involved in the theoretical modeling of the explosion's visibility and dust plume. but the risks were staggering. Even a small miscalculation could send radioactive material toward Earth. And as public awareness of nuclear testing grew, officials quietly shelved the plan. The reasoning shifted from intimidation to inspiration. Instead of nuking the moon, the US decided to visit it. Project A119 remained classified for decades, dismissed as rumor until declassified documents confirmed its existence in the late 1990s. It's one of those stories that feels like a parody of the Cold War, an era when fear and pride could make even the most intelligent minds consider turning the night sky into a flash of light. They didn't nuke the moon. They settled for planting a flag instead, proof that sometimes humanity chooses spectacle without destruction. Operation Cauldron, a stretch of cold grey water off the coast of Scotland. In the summer of 1952, a small Royal Navy ship drifts near the Isle of Lewis. On deck, British scientists prepare to release invisible clouds of bacteria, not to attack an enemy, but to study how deadly they might be. The project was called Operation Cauldron, and for decades, no one outside the military knew it had ever happened. The early 1950s were an anxious time. The Cold War was new, and so was the idea of biological warfare. Britain's scientists wanted to know how germs could spread in battle, and how to defend against them. The solution they came up with was both methodical and disturbing. Test live biological agents on animals at sea. Cages filled with monkeys, guinea pigs, and other animals lined the decks of a ship. British researchers released clouds of bacteria, plague, anthrax, and brucellosis, and then waited to see what happened. The wind carried the germs over the animals. Some died. Others were dissected to measure the infection's reach. The tests might have remained a classified footnote, if not for an accident. During one experiment, a fishing trawler sailed unknowingly through a contaminated zone. The ship's crew was tracked in secret for weeks to make sure they didn't spread disease. They never found out what had happened, and were never told. Operation Cauldron was finally declassified decades later, revealing how close Britain had come to creating a real biohazard off its own shores. It wasn't the work of villains, just scientists and soldiers convinced that fear justified the risk. But in hindsight, the name Cauldron feels grimly fitting. A pot of dangerous ideas bubbling quietly in the fog. Operation Sea Spray. A cold fog rolled over San Francisco Bay one September morning in 1950. To most residents, it looked like nothing more than the city's usual mist. What no one knew was that the U.S. Navy had filled that fog with bacteria. The operation was called Sea Spray, part of a series of secret biological warfare tests during the early Cold War. The Navy wanted to know how vulnerable an American city might be to a germ attack, and San Francisco, with its natural fog and dense population, seemed like the perfect test site. Over several days, a Navy ship anchored off the coast released clouds of two bacterial species, Serratia marcescens and Bacillus globigii. Both were believed to be harmless, ideal for simulating biological weapons. The bacteria drifted across the bay, settling over homes, hospitals, and streets. By the Navy's own estimates, nearly every one of San Francisco's 800,000 residents inhaled millions of bacterial particles. Shortly afterward, doctors at Stanford Hospital noticed something unusual, a cluster of rare infections caused by Serratia marcescens. One man, recovering from surgery, died from complications. The connection to the Navy's test wasn't made public at the time, and officials denied any wrongdoing. It wasn't until the 1970s through congressional hearings and declassified documents, that the truth emerged. Operation Sea Spray was just one of hundreds of similar open-air biological experiments conducted across the United States. The tests were designed to measure dispersion patterns, but they used real microorganisms and real people without consent. The government later acknowledged the experiment, but maintained the bacteria were not known to be dangerous. For San Francisco, it was a chilling revelation, the kind that makes ordinary fog feel a little heavier. After all, it wasn't the enemy testing the city, it was its own navy. MK Ultra. He thought he was just volunteering for a psychology study. A few pills, some observation, maybe a small payment. What he didn't know was that behind the mirror, men from the CIA were taking notes, testing how far the human mind could be pushed before it broke. The project had a name that sounded harmless, even bureaucratic: MK Ultra. Launched in 1953, MK Ultra was born from Cold War fear. American officials were convinced the Soviets and Chinese had discovered new ways to control minds through hypnosis, drugs, or psychological conditioning. The CIA's answer was to experiment before their enemies did. Their goal was chilling: to learn how to manipulate memory, behavior, and even identity. Under the direction of chemist Sidney Gottlieb, the agency's scientists began testing LSD and other hallucinogens on thousands of people, often without their consent. Prisoners, mental hospital patients, soldiers, and unsuspecting civilians became subjects in a sprawling network of secret experiments. Some were drugged and interrogated for days. Others were subjected to sensory deprivation, sleep disruption, or hypnosis. One test site, run by psychiatrist Ewan Cameron in Montreal, carried out what he called psychic driving. Patients seeking treatment for anxiety or depression were kept in drug-induced comas, bombarded with repetitive audio messages, and given massive electroshock therapy. Many never recovered. The CIA even ran safe houses in San Francisco and New York under Operation Midnight Climax, where sex workers lured men to rooms wired for surveillance. Drinks were secretly laced with LSD as agents watched from behind one-way glass. When the truth emerged in the 1970s through congressional investigations, Americans were stunned. The agency had spent 2 decades trying to master mind control and had instead created chaos, trauma, and tragedy. MK Ultra didn't uncover the secrets of the mind, it revealed the dangers of believing you have the right to own one. Big Tobacco lied about cancer. Smoke curls through the air, soft, elegant, harmless. For decades, that was the image. Doctors endorsed it. Actors swore by it. Even athletes appeared in cigarette ads. The idea that smoking could kill you wasn't just dismissed, it was laughed at. And yet, behind that cloud of smoke, the tobacco industry already knew the truth. By the early 1950s, independent researchers had started linking cigarette smoking to lung cancer. The evidence was alarming. In response, the major tobacco companies didn't change their products. They changed their strategy. In 1954, they published a statement called A Frank Statement to Cigarette Smokers. It appeared in newspapers nationwide, signed by every major company. They denied the connection between smoking and disease and promised to fund independent research to find the truth. That research was anything but independent. Internal documents, later made public, revealed a decades-long campaign of deception. Tobacco companies manipulated data, funded friendly scientists, and launched marketing campaigns to cast doubt on medical findings. Their own labs had already confirmed what public health experts were warning. nicotine was addictive and cigarettes caused cancer. But publicly, they denied it all. The strategy was simple: create confusion. Doubt, one memo read, is our product. The longer the debate lasted, the longer people kept smoking. It wasn't until the 1990s, through whistleblowers and lawsuits, that the full scope of the cover-up came to light. Executives were forced to testify before Congress, each one denying under oath that nicotine was addictive. The documents said otherwise. For half a century, an industry built its fortune on addiction, selling death with a smile and a slogan. The story of big tobacco isn't just about cigarettes. It's about the power of denial and how smoke and mirrors can hide the truth in plain sight. The Ford Pinto scandal. On highways across America in the early 1970s, a new compact car became a common sight. Small, stylish, and affordable. It was the Ford Pinto, a symbol of modern efficiency. But beneath that clean design hid a secret so grim, it would become one of the most infamous corporate scandals in US history. When Ford began developing the Pinto in the late 1960s, competition from Japanese automakers was fierce. The company set strict limits: under £2,000, under $2,000, and on the market in record time. That rush left little room for safety. During crash tests, engineers discovered a critical flaw. The fuel tank, positioned just behind the rear bumper, could easily rupture in even minor rear-end collisions. The result was catastrophic fires. Engineers proposed cheap, practical fixes: a plastic shield for $1, a rubber bladder for about $10. But management turned them down. A delay in production, they warned, would cost millions. The truth came out years later when internal documents were leaked, among them a now notorious cost-benefit analysis. In it, Ford calculated the price of human life. The company estimated that fixing all Pintos would cost about $137 million, while paying damages for burn deaths and injuries would cost only $49 million. So, the company chose to do nothing. By the mid-1970s, accident victims and survivors began filing lawsuits. News outlets picked up the story, and the Pinto's image shifted overnight, from a budget-friendly car to a rolling fire hazard. Ford finally recalled the model in 1978, after public outrage and a criminal case that accused the company of reckless disregard for safety. The Pinto scandal revealed something haunting. The problem wasn't just a faulty car. It was a mindset, one that treated people as numbers and tragedy as a business expense. Dupont and Teflon cover-up. Most kitchens share one quiet invention: the pan that never sticks. It slides eggs effortlessly and cleans with a wipe. For half a century, it was a symbol of progress. But the chemical that made it possible would eventually reveal one of the most shocking corporate cover-ups in modern history. The story traces back to the 1940s, when the chemical giant Dupont began using a compound called PFOA, perfluorooctanoic acid, to make its miracle product, Teflon. It was heat-resistant, waterproof, and endlessly useful. There was just one problem. The company's scientists quickly learned that PFOA didn't go away. Not in water, not in soil, not in the human body. Once released, it stayed, forever. By the 1960s, DuPont's internal research showed that PFOA was toxic in animals. 2 decades later, it was appearing in the blood of their factory workers and even in local drinking water near their plant in West Virginia. Still, the company said nothing. Instead, they buried their findings and quietly tracked illnesses among employees, miscarriages, cancers, deformities, all while reassuring the public that Teflon was completely safe. The deception might have remained hidden if not for a West Virginia farmer, Wilbur Tennant, whose cattle began dying after drinking from a polluted creek. His case led environmental lawyer Robert Bilott to Dupont's internal files. Thousands of pages showing decades of concealed evidence. The lawsuit that followed uncovered what Dupont already knew. PFOA was a poison that had spread far beyond the factory. Today, it's found in the blood of nearly every human on Earth. Dupont called Teflon a miracle of modern living. In a way, it was. Just not the kind anyone wanted. Some miracles, it turns out, never wash off. Facebook's mood experiment. Scrolling through Facebook once felt harmless, a mix of smiling friends, birthday posts, and news headlines. But in 2014, users learned something unsettling. The platform hadn't just been showing them random posts. It had been quietly manipulating their emotions. The project was called the Emotional Contagion Study. Conducted in 2012, it involved nearly 700,000 Facebook users. Without their knowledge, Facebook's data scientists altered what appeared in their news feeds. For some, positive posts were filtered out. For others, the negative ones were reduced. The goal was to see if emotions could spread online, if simply seeing more happiness or sadness could change how people felt and posted. The results were clear. Users exposed to fewer positive posts wrote gloomier updates, while those shown less negativity became slightly cheerier. Facebook had proven what advertisers had always hoped. Moods were contagious, even through pixels. When the study was published 2 years later in the journal PNAS, the reaction was immediate and fierce. Critics called it psychological manipulation, accusing Facebook of treating its users as lab rats in a secret social experiment. No one had given consent. No one even knew it had happened. Facebook defended the research, arguing it was part of improving the user experience. But behind that explanation was something larger. Proof that the company could, at scale, influence how millions of people felt, all by changing what they saw for a few days. The story faded as quickly as it broke. Most users kept scrolling, but the experiment left a lasting mark on how we think about technology. Facebook didn't just study emotion, it shaped it. And in doing so, it asked a quiet, haunting question. If our moods can be engineered, whose feelings are we really having? Cambridge Analytica. It started with a quiz. A harmless little game on Facebook. Which Disney character are you? Or, what kind of thinker are you? Millions clicked, laughed, and shared. But behind those quizzes was a company quietly building psychological profiles on tens of millions of people. Its name was Cambridge Analytica. The company was founded in 2013, backed by wealthy political donors who believed data could win elections. Their idea was simple. If you could understand voters' personalities, their fears, hopes, and hidden biases, you could tailor messages to manipulate how they felt and how they voted. To do it, Cambridge Analytica turned to Facebook. Through a researcher's quiz app, it collected personal information not just from people who took the quiz, but from their friends, harvesting names, likes, interests, and private details from over 87 million users without consent. The data was used to build psychographic profiles, predicting how individuals might respond to specific political messages. By 2016, those insights became a weapon. Cambridge Analytica worked on political campaigns across the globe, including the U.S. presidential election and the Brexit referendum, using targeted ads to exploit emotional triggers, fear, anger, nationalism. Most voters never realized they were being psychologically profiled in real time. The scandal broke in 2018 when whistleblower Christopher Wiley revealed how the company had weaponized Facebook data for political manipulation. Public outrage was swift. Cambridge Analytica collapsed within months, and Facebook faced global scrutiny for its role in the breach. The incident exposed something quietly profound: the price of free platforms. When data becomes a tool of persuasion, truth itself becomes malleable. Cambridge Analytica promised to change how politics worked. It did, by proving just how easy it is to hack democracy without ever touching a single vote. Volkswagen emissions scandal. Car ads have always sold more than machines. They sell trust, clean lines, clean air, clean conscience. For years, Volkswagen built its image on that promise. The diesel cars were marketed as efficient, powerful, and, most importantly, environmentally friendly. Clean diesel, they called it. What no one knew was that it was a lie, one written into the car's very code. The story began in 2009 when Volkswagen introduced a new generation of diesel engines that seemed to defy physics. Low emissions, high performance. Regulators were impressed. Customers were thrilled. Sales boomed. But a few scientists at a small research center in West Virginia noticed something strange. When they tested the cars on the road, emissions were up to 40 times higher than legal limits. At first, it seemed like an error. But as the investigation deepened, the truth emerged. Volkswagen had installed defeat devices, secret software that could detect when a car was being tested in a lab. During tests, the software reduced emissions. Once the car hit the road, it reverted to normal performance, spewing nitrogen oxides into the air. The deception lasted for years and involved nearly 11 million vehicles worldwide. It wasn't uncovered by governments or insiders, but by independent researchers. And once the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency confronted Volkswagen in 2015, the scandal exploded. Executives scrambled, admitting the fraud after weeks of denial. The company paid billions in fines, and several officials faced criminal charges. Volkswagen called it a technical mistake. But the truth was simpler. The company had built a global reputation on environmental responsibility while quietly poisoning the air. It was supposed to be the dawn of cleaner cars. Instead, it became proof that sometimes the dirtiest thing about an engine is the story behind it. Coca-Cola in Colombia. A cold bottle of Coke has always symbolized something simple: refreshment, happiness, a universal brand that seemed untouched by politics or conflict. But in Colombia during the 1990s, that red label took on a darker meaning. Behind factory walls and marketing smiles, union leaders at Coca-Cola bottling plants were being threatened, kidnapped, and even killed. The story begins in a country torn by civil war. Colombia's decades-long conflict between left-wing guerrillas, right-wing paramilitaries, and the government left workers, journalists, and activists caught in the middle. Inside this chaos, Coca-Cola's local bottling partners faced growing labor unrest. Workers organized unions, demanding better pay and conditions. What followed was a wave of violence that seemed too coordinated to be random. Union leaders were targeted by paramilitary groups, armed men who stormed plants, issued death threats, and executed organizers. Survivors accused bottling managers of colluding with these groups to silence labor movements. At first, it sounded impossible that one of the world's most recognizable corporations, could be tied to paramilitary terror. But soon, testimonies, witness statements, and legal filings painted a chilling picture. In 2001, US and Colombian labor unions filed a lawsuit under the Alien Tort Claims Act, accusing Coca-Cola and its bottlers of being complicit in the violence. The company denied all involvement, claiming the attacks were local issues beyond its control. US courts ultimately dismissed the case on jurisdictional grounds, never ruling on Coca-Cola's direct responsibility. Still, the damage to the brand's image was done. Global boycotts followed, and Killer Coke became a rallying cry among human rights groups. The truth remains murky, but one thing is clear. In a country where speaking out could cost your life, even a soda company wasn't immune to bloodshed. The world's most popular drink had, for a moment, lost its fizz. Shell in Nigeria. The Niger Delta is one of the richest oil regions in the world and one of the poorest places to live. For decades, its rivers have run slick with crude, its air thick with gas flares that never go out. At the center of it all sits one of the world's biggest energy companies, Shell. When Shell began drilling in Nigeria in the 1950s, it promised progress, jobs, schools, infrastructure. But what followed was environmental collapse. Decades of oil spills poisoned the soil and water. Fishing villages lost their livelihoods. Crops failed. And when locals demanded accountability, they didn't just face silence, they faced violence. By the 1990s, tensions in the Niger Delta had erupted. The Ogoni people, led by writer and activist Ken Saro-Wiwa, accused Shell of exploiting their land while leaving behind destruction. He founded the movement for the survival of the Ogoni people, organizing peaceful protests that drew international attention. Shell publicly denied responsibility, but privately, documents later showed, company officials had close ties with Nigeria's military regime, the same regime that violently crushed dissent. In 1995, Saro-Wiwa and 8 other activists were arrested on trumped-up charges and executed after a sham trial. Their deaths shocked the world. Shell insisted it had no involvement, but years later, in a US lawsuit, survivors accused the company of complicity in human rights abuses, even alleging that Shell provided money and logistics to security forces. The company settled out of court for $15.5 million, without admitting guilt. Today, oil still flows from the delta, and spills still darken its wetlands. For Shell, Nigeria was once a symbol of growth. For the people who live there, it became a reminder that sometimes the true cost of energy isn't paid in dollars, but in lives. Watergate, June 17, 1972. Just after midnight, a security guard at the Watergate office complex in Washington, D.C. noticed something odd: tape covering a door latch. He called the police. Minutes later, 5 men in suits were caught inside the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee, carrying cameras, wiretaps, and crisp $100 bills linked to the Nixon re-election campaign. It seemed small at first, a strange burglary during an election year. No one knew it would bring down a president. At the time, Richard Nixon was running for a second term, obsessed with control and secrecy. Inside the White House, he had created a covert team called the Plumbers, tasked with stopping leaks and discrediting opponents. The break-in at Watergate was part of that plan, an attempt to gather political intelligence. When the burglars were caught, the White House denied any connection, but 2 young reporters at the Washington Post, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, began to follow the money. Their stories uncovered a trail of secret funds, hush money, and a campaign of political sabotage that reached deep into the administration. The conspiracy unraveled slowly. Senate hearings, whistleblowers, and a special prosecutor revealed that Nixon had installed a secret taping system in the Oval Office. And those tapes captured everything. In August 1974, facing certain impeachment, Nixon resigned. It was the first time a US president had ever done so. Watergate became more than a scandal. It became shorthand for the corruption of power, proof that paranoia at the top could infect an entire government. What began with a strip of tape on a door ended with the most powerful man in the world forced to admit the truth. The only thing more dangerous than a break-in was getting caught trying to cover it up. Nsa Mass Surveillance. Most people never think twice about sending a text, making a call, or searching something online. But for years, every one of those actions was being quietly watched, not by hackers or criminals, but by the US government itself. What sounded like a paranoid fantasy in the early 2000s turned out to be one of the largest surveillance operations in human history. The idea of government monitoring wasn't new. After September 11th, fear of terrorism reshaped global security. The US Congress passed the Patriot Act, granting sweeping powers to intelligence agencies. Officially, it was to track foreign threats. In practice, it gave the National Security Agency, the NSA, permission to collect unimaginable amounts of data, often from its own citizens. Working with major telecom companies, the NSA built systems capable of intercepting emails, phone calls, and internet activity across the globe. Programs like PRISM allowed access to data from tech giants, Google, Facebook, Apple, Microsoft, all in the name of national security. For years, this was dismissed as conspiracy talk. Then, in 2013, an analyst named Edward Snowden changed everything. Snowden leaked thousands of classified documents to journalists, revealing that the NSA had indeed been running secret programs to monitor both foreigners and Americans without warrants or oversight. The files showed entire networks of global surveillance, tracking not just suspected terrorists, but journalists, diplomats, and ordinary people. The US government called Snowden a traitor. Others called him a whistleblower. The debate still divides the world. The revelations forced new privacy laws, international outrage, and a reckoning over what security really means in a digital age. The NSA claimed it was only collecting data, not listening. But in an era when data is identity, that might be the same thing. Walt Disney worked with the FBI. Few things feel more innocent than a Disney movie. The castles, the music, the promise that good always triumphs. But behind the wholesome image of Walt Disney Studios was a man with powerful friends, including one of the most controversial figures in American history, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. The story begins in the 1940s, when Hollywood found itself under suspicion. The government feared communist influence in films, and studios were quietly cooperating with federal investigators. Walt Disney, a staunch anti-communist and one of the first to testify before the House Un-American Activities Committee, offered more than his opinion. He offered his help. Declassified FBI files, released decades later under the Freedom of Information Act, revealed that Disney had been listed as a special agent in charge, contact for the FBI's Los Angeles field office. It wasn't a law enforcement role, but it meant he was trusted, someone who could provide information and access when needed. The collaboration went both ways. In return for his loyalty, Disney worked closely with the Bureau to shape the public image of law enforcement. In the 1950s, the FBI reviewed scripts for episodes of the Mickey Mouse Club and even a proposed Disneyland film about federal agents. Hoover himself toured Disneyland before it opened, ensuring the park projected the right image of American values. Disney's relationship with the FBI wasn't sinister in the spy thriller sense, but it was revealing. A man known for crafting dreams also helped shape a vision of America that fit the Bureau's moral code: patriotic, clean-cut, and obedient. For Walt Disney, fantasy and control were two sides of the same coin, and in his world, even magic required federal approval. Operation Hemisphere. Some conspiracies don't hide in the shadows. They live in the phone records we use every day. For years, the U.S. government has been accused of tracking citizens' calls without warrants. Most of those claims seemed exaggerated. Then came Operation Hemisphere, a surveillance program so vast and secretive that even many law enforcement officials didn't know it existed. It began quietly in the late 1980s as the war on drugs intensified. The government partnered with one of the country's biggest phone companies, AT&T, to create a special database of call records. It wasn't limited to criminals or suspects. It included nearly every call that passed through the company's network. Who called whom, when, and from where. The data stretched back decades, creating a map of communication across the United States and beyond. What made Operation Hemisphere different was who controlled it. Unlike the NSA, which was bound by federal oversight, Hemisphere operated out of AT&T offices, staffed by company employees working alongside drug enforcement agents. They could access trillions of records instantly, often without a warrant. When agents needed information, AT&T analysts would provide it, sometimes within hours, complete with phone patterns, locations, and relationships. The public didn't know it existed until 2013, when the New York Times published leaked documents describing the program. The revelations stunned privacy advocates. Even some prosecutors were unaware they'd been using data from a system that sidestepped traditional legal channels. Officials defended the program as a tool for fighting drug cartels and organized crime. But critics saw something else: a secret surveillance partnership between corporate America and the government. Operation Hemisphere blurred the boundary between public safety and private life. It showed that in the digital age, every connection, every call, is part of someone's map. The Milgram Experiment. A man sits in a small Yale laboratory, hand trembling over a row of switches. Each is labelled with a higher voltage, 15, 30, 45, all the way up to 450 volts. A voice from the next room screams in pain. The man hesitates, looks to the researcher beside him, and is calmly told, "The experiment requires that you continue." That scene wasn't from a dystopian film. It was a real psychological experiment conducted in 1961 by Stanley Milgram, a young Yale professor haunted by one question: could ordinary people be led to commit terrible acts simply by following orders? Milgram's experiment was deceptively simple. Participants believed they were helping test memory by administering electric shocks to another volunteer for wrong answers. In reality, no shocks were delivered. The victim was an actor, and the real subject was the person flipping the switches. As the screams grew louder and the actor begged to be released, most people didn't stop. Under the quiet authority of a man in a lab coat, 65% of participants continued to the highest voltage, believing they were delivering potentially lethal shocks. Some laughed nervously, others protested, but nearly all obeyed. When news of the study broke, the public was horrified. Many called it unethical, manipulative, even sadistic. But Milgram insisted his work revealed something vital, that obedience to authority could override morality itself. His findings echoed uncomfortably close to the defense used by Nazi war criminals. "I was just following orders." The Milgram experiment blurred the line between science and cruelty, exposing a truth more unsettling than any conspiracy. Evil doesn't always come from monsters. Sometimes it comes from ordinary people, sitting in bright rooms, doing what they're told, one switch at a time. Stanford Prison Experiment. It began like a game. In August 1971, a group of college students walked into the basement of Stanford University's psychology department, laughing, joking, and curious about what a mock prison experiment would be like. Within 48 hours, the laughter was gone. This was the Stanford Prison Experiment, led by psychologist Philip Zimbardo. The idea was simple. Divide 24 healthy, stable young men into two groups, guards and prisoners, and observe how they adapted to their roles in a simulated jail. The study was supposed to last 2 weeks. It didn't make it past 6 days. The guards were told they could maintain order as they saw fit. No physical violence, but full authority otherwise. Almost immediately, things changed. Guards began enforcing strict rules, waking prisoners in the middle of the night, ordering push-ups, humiliating them. Prisoners rebelled, cried, broke down emotionally. Zimbardo himself, acting as the prison superintendent, became absorbed in the illusion. The line between experiment and reality vanished. What made it so haunting wasn't just how fast it deteriorated. It was how easily ordinary students, playing pretend, began to mimic authoritarian cruelty. No one told them to abuse others. They just did. When one graduate student, Christina Maslach, walked in and saw the chaos, she demanded the experiment be shut down. Zimbardo ended it the next day, realizing even he had been consumed by the role he created. The experiment became infamous, a symbol of how power corrupts and systems shape behavior. But later critics questioned its design and ethics, suggesting participants were influenced or even coached. Still, its message endures. The Stanford Prison Experiment didn't just study authority. It showed how easily good people forget who they are, once the door of the cell closes behind them. Human plutonium experiments. Hospitals are supposed to be places of healing. Yet in the years following World War II, a number of American hospitals quietly became sites of something much darker. Experiments that treated patients not as people, but as data points. They were injected with plutonium, one of the deadliest substances on Earth, and told it was medicine. The program began in 1945, at the height of the atomic age. Scientists working under the Manhattan Project had built the bomb, but didn't yet understand what prolonged exposure to radiation might do to the human body. Instead of using animal testing, they decided to use human beings without their consent. 18 hospital patients across the United States, from California to Tennessee, were secretly injected with radioactive plutonium. Some were terminally ill, others had minor conditions. None were told the truth. Doctors carefully recorded how the element moved through their blood, tissues, and bones, tracking the invisible damage as if it were a routine medical study. For decades, the files stayed hidden behind government secrecy. Families never knew what had been done. It wasn't until 1993, when journalist Eileen Wellsome uncovered a trail of classified documents, that the story broke open. Her reporting revealed names, doses, and the staggering indifference behind it all. The resulting scandal forced the U.S. government to admit the truth and apologize. The justification was always the same: national security, scientific necessity, the greater good. But behind those words were ordinary people whose trust was quietly betrayed in the name of progress. The human plutonium experiments weren't a myth or a rumor. They were real, deliberate acts of deception. And they proved something chilling. When science loses its humanity, every discovery comes at a human cost. Project 4.1. The sky over the Marshall Islands glowed brighter than day. On March 1st, 1954, the United States detonated its largest ever nuclear device, Castle Bravo, on Bikini Atoll. The explosion was far more powerful than predicted, sending a cloud of radioactive fallout across the Pacific. Islanders miles away watched what looked like snow falling from the sky. They didn't know it was poison. What followed became known as Project 4.1, a secret medical study to observe the effects of radiation on humans. Officially, it was described as a study of the biological effects of fallout. In reality, it meant tracking the health of the Marshallese people who had been exposed, without their informed consent. When residents of Rongelap and Uterik atolls began developing burns, nausea, and hair loss, the US government airlifted them to hospitals for testing. Doctors took blood, measured radiation levels, and documented every symptom. They called it a humanitarian mission. But the records showed something colder. Scientists were collecting data, not offering cures. For years, the US insisted the exposure had been accidental, but declassified documents later suggested something more unsettling, that the government had known fallout would reach inhabited islands and saw it as a unique research opportunity. Islanders were periodically returned to contaminated areas to monitor recovery. Generations suffered cancers, birth defects, and environmental destruction long after the tests ended. When survivors learned the truth decades later, they called it what it was: human experimentation disguised as aid. The US eventually paid limited compensation, but for many, it came too late. Project 4.1 wasn't an experiment born of malice. It was born of indifference. And sometimes, indifference leaves scars deeper than intent, ones that glow long after the blast has faded. UK's Windrush Scandal. He'd lived in Britain since childhood, paid taxes, raised a family, even served in the Royal Air Force. Yet one morning, decades later, a letter arrived saying he wasn't supposed to be there, that he was an illegal immigrant. Within months, his life unravelled. This was the quiet cruelty at the heart of the Windrush Scandal. The story begins in 1948, when the ship Empire Windrush docked at Tilbury, carrying hundreds of Caribbean men and women to help rebuild post-war Britain. They were citizens of the Commonwealth, invited to work in hospitals, on buses, in factories. For the next 20 years, thousands more came, shaping British life in ways that endure today. But in 2012, a government policy known as the hostile environment set out to make life impossible for undocumented immigrants. To prove their right to live in the country, people suddenly needed paperwork that many of them never had. Birth certificates, landing cards, decades-old documents, most long gone or, in some cases, deliberately destroyed by the Home Office. One by one, members of the Windrush generation began losing jobs, homes, and healthcare. Some were detained in immigration centres. Others were deported to countries they hadn't seen since childhood. For years, officials denied it was happening, until journalists exposed internal records showing the government knew exactly what was unfolding. When the scandal finally broke in 2018, the public was stunned. The Home Secretary resigned. The Prime Minister apologised. But compensation has been slow, and many victims have died waiting. The Windrush scandal wasn't about identity, it was about amnesia. A country that once asked its colonies for help forgot the people who answered. And for those who stayed, citizenship turned out to be something that could be erased with a single missing form. The FIFA bribery scandal. It's the world's most beloved sport, a game that unites billions. Yet for decades, behind the cheers and the trophies, football's governing body was quietly running something that looked less like a sporting institution and more like a global cartel. This is the story of FIFA's bribery scandal, a conspiracy so outrageous that for years, people refused to believe it could be true. For much of the 20th century, FIFA presented itself as a guardian of the beautiful game. But beneath the polished image was a web of backroom deals, offshore accounts, and envelopes stuffed with cash. Allegations of corruption had long surrounded World Cup bidding, whispers that votes were bought, tournaments traded, and powerful nations courted through secret payments. Still, FIFA denied everything. That illusion shattered in May 2015 when Swiss police raided a luxury hotel in Zurich at dawn. 7 senior FIFA officials were arrested on charges brought by the U.S. Department of Justice. The accusations were staggering: over $150 million in bribes and kickbacks tied to media rights, sponsorships, and World Cup hosting bids. Officials had allegedly taken payments in exchange for granting broadcasting contracts and tournament votes, all laundered through complex financial networks. The scandal traced back decades, from South Africa's 2010 World Cup bid to Qatar's controversial 2022 selection. Investigators found trails of money leading to executive accounts and shell companies. Longtime FIFA president Sepp Blatter resigned under pressure, denying wrongdoing, but leaving behind a legacy tainted beyond repair. What shocked the world wasn't just that FIFA was corrupt, it was how normal corruption had become within it. The world watched the World Cup for its moments of magic. Meanwhile, in the boardrooms, another kind of game was being played, one where the highest bidder always won. The Bcci Scandal. On paper, it was just another international bank, the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, or Bcci. Its ads promised opportunity, unity, and global trust. But behind the polished image, Bcci wasn't a bank at all. It was a maze of shell companies, secret accounts, and shadow clients. A financial empire built on deception. Founded in 1972 by Pakistani financier Aga Hassan Abedi, Bcci grew faster than almost any bank in history. It called itself the world's bank, boasting clients in 78 countries. From the outside, it looked like a success story of globalization. Inside, it was chaos and corruption on a breathtaking scale. By the 1980s, investigators began whispering that Bcci wasn't just laundering money, it was helping governments, intelligence agencies, terrorists, and cartels move it. The CIA, the KGB, and even drug lords like Pablo Escobar allegedly used its services. It handled bribes, funded illegal arms deals, and hid fortunes for dictators. The scandal broke open in 1991, when regulators in multiple countries finally moved in. Auditors discovered billions of dollars missing and records deliberately falsified. Bcci had hidden bad loans, stolen deposits, and forged entire ledgers. US investigators called it the largest banking fraud in world financial history. More than $20 billion vanished. Clients across continents lost everything. Politicians scrambled to distance themselves. And beneath it all, documents showed Bcci's ties to intelligence operations, including covert US funding of Afghan fighters during the Cold War. For years, people had joked that banks were run by criminals. With BCCI, it wasn't a joke. It was the business model. When the bank collapsed, it left behind more than financial wreckage. It exposed how easily the global system could be manipulated, not by hackers or terrorists, but by men in suits who already owned the vault. The Panama Papers. The leak didn't come from a whistleblower's speech or a politician's confession. It came from a quiet message sent to a single journalist. Interested in data? That message would soon unravel one of the biggest financial scandals in history, the Panama Papers. In 2015, an anonymous source contacted reporters at the German newspaper Süddeutsche Zeitung, offering a leak too large to believe: 11.5 million confidential files from a Panamanian law firm called Mossack Fonseca. The documents detailed how the world's richest individuals, corporations, and political leaders secretly moved money through offshore accounts and shell companies to hide their wealth. It wasn't technically illegal to own an offshore company, but what the files revealed went far beyond tax avoidance. They exposed a hidden global system of corruption. World leaders like Vladimir Putin, the Prime Minister of Iceland, and relatives of the Chinese president were linked to networks of secret accounts. Celebrities, billionaires, and even FIFA officials appeared in the data. The record showed how Mossack Fonseca created fake companies, disguised ownership, and helped clients move fortunes away from public scrutiny, and often from justice. To verify the information, the newspaper enlisted the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, ICIJ. Over 370 reporters from 76 countries worked in secret for a year before publishing their findings in April 2016. The fallout was immediate. Protests erupted, governments launched investigations, and the Icelandic Prime Minister resigned. For years, people suspected that the wealthy played by different rules, that somewhere beyond the reach of ordinary taxes and laws, their money lived untouched. The Panama Papers proved it. When the world saw the truth laid bare, one quiet fact became clear. Corruption doesn't always happen in smoke-filled rooms. Sometimes it's neatly typed on letterhead and hidden in plain sight. Operation Mockery. Sometimes the easiest way to control what people think is to control what they read. That simple truth lay behind one of the CIA's most ambitious and unsettling projects, Operation Mockingbird. During the Cold War, information was power. The Soviet Union had propaganda. The United States had something more subtle, influence. Starting in the late 1940s, the CIA quietly began recruiting journalists, editors, and media executives from some of the world's most respected outlets. The mission was simple: shape the news to serve American interests. Reporters were given access, tips, and sometimes cash. Stories were planted, headlines adjusted, narratives polished to fit US foreign policy goals. Major newspapers like the Washington Post, Time, and the New York Times were said to have journalists who either cooperated knowingly or were fed information through intermediaries. The goal wasn't just to push propaganda abroad, it was to manage public perception at home. For decades, the operation remained a rumor, dismissed as Cold War paranoia. Then, in 1975, the Church Committee, a Senate investigation into CIA activities, uncovered proof of extensive media manipulation. Documents revealed that the agency had dozens of working journalists on its payroll, some even embedded in foreign bureaus to spread disinformation or gather intelligence. The CIA officially claimed to have ended the practice soon after. But the legacy of Operation Mockingbird lingers. It revealed that even the freest press in the world could be quietly bent toward power, not through censorship, but through cooperation. When people talk about fake news today, they often imagine social media algorithms or foreign bots. But Operation Mockingbird proved that long before the internet, the truth itself was already a battleground, and the pen just another instrument of war. Project Blue Book. It started with lights in the sky. In the years after World War II, reports of strange, fast-moving objects began flooding in from across the United States. Pilots, soldiers, and ordinary citizens all describing the same thing: unidentified flying objects. The public called them UFOs. The government called them a national security concern. In 1952, the U.S. Air Force launched Project Blue Book, a top-secret investigation into thousands of UFO sightings. Its mission? To determine whether these objects were a threat, and if not, to explain them away. Under the direction of astronomer Dr. J. Allen Hynek, teams of scientists and officers examined radar data, interviewed witnesses, and visited crash sites across the country. Between 1952 and 1969, Project Blue Book catalogued more than 12,000 cases. Most were explained: weather balloons, aircraft, or natural phenomena. But 701 remained officially unidentified. Despite this, the Air Force publicly maintained that there was no evidence of extraterrestrial activity. The project's findings were intended to calm the public, not fuel imagination. Yet the opposite happened. Leaks, inconsistencies, and classified briefings led many to suspect that the government was hiding something bigger. UFO researchers accused Blue Book of being a smokescreen, a public relations effort to downplay sightings, while the real research happened behind closed doors. In 1969, the program was abruptly shut down, following the Cauldron report, which concluded UFOs posed no scientific value. But Dr. Hynek himself later admitted he'd grown skeptical of the project's intentions, becoming one of the most respected voices in UFO research. For some, Project Blue Book proved the government took UFOs seriously. For others, it confirmed a cover-up. Either way, it left one truth hovering in the air. Sometimes, the harder you try to explain the unknown, the more mysterious it becomes. The British planned to drop glue on Nazi troops. Imagine being in a government war office during World War II, papers piled high, cigarette smoke curling toward the ceiling, and a group of scientists calmly discussing how best to defeat the Nazis. With glue. Yes, glue. The plan, approved by Britain's Special Operations Executive, was as outlandish as it sounds. Around 1940, with Nazi forces spreading across Europe, British intelligence began developing sticky sabotage weapons, materials so adhesive they could disable vehicles, immobilize enemy troops, and even trap entire convoys in place. The idea was to literally stop the German war machine from moving. The weapon of choice was a highly viscous adhesive known as glue number. One developed in secret laboratories. Scientists tested it on animals, vehicles, and even mock battlefields to study its sticking power. When dropped from aircraft, it was supposed to coat roads, runways, and supply lines, gluing equipment and soldiers in place. Other proposals included smearing it on enemy barracks and fuel dumps, even on Nazi boots. It wasn't just theoretical. Reports suggest small-scale tests were conducted, including one infamous trial in which the glue trapped farm animals and sent an unfortunate cow into a panic. Ultimately, the plan was scrapped. The glue wasn't weatherproof, and pilots feared it would gum up their own aircraft before reaching the target. Yet this bizarre project reveals something profound about wartime innovation and desperation. The same minds that built radar and code breakers were also brainstorming how to glue the enemy to the ground. It's a story that sounds like slapstick science fiction, but it's very real. And somewhere in a British archive, there's a classified memo confirming that, at least for a brief moment in history, someone truly believed that glue could win a world war. The Windscale fire cover-up. A grey October morning in 1957. On the northwest coast of England, a faint plume of smoke rises from the Windscale nuclear plant in Cumbria. To most, it looked like an ordinary day. But inside Britain's first nuclear reactor, something had gone terribly wrong. Within hours, the country would face its worst nuclear disaster, one the government would spend decades downplaying. The Windscale reactors, built hastily after World War II, were part of Britain's secret effort to produce plutonium for nuclear weapons. On October 10th, technicians noticed temperatures climbing far beyond normal. One of the graphite cores had caught fire, a nightmare scenario. Workers struggled to control the blaze as radioactive smoke poured into the air. When water hoses failed, one engineer, Tom Tuohy, climbed the reactor tower himself and ordered the core to be flooded. It saved the facility, and likely much of northern England, from destruction. But what followed was not heroism celebrated, but silence. The government immediately imposed secrecy. Publicly, officials called it a minor incident. Privately, they knew radioactive iodine and polonium had drifted across the countryside, contaminating milk and farmland. Thousands of gallons of milk were quietly destroyed. No evacuation was ever ordered. For years, the full scale of the disaster was hidden. It wasn't until the late 1970s, after declassified reports and health studies surfaced, that the truth emerged. Dozens of plant workers had been exposed to dangerous radiation levels, and the fallout likely caused hundreds of cancer cases over the following decades. Windscale was later renamed Sellafield, as if a new name could erase its history. The fire burned for 3 days. The cover-up lasted for 30 years. In the end, Windscale wasn't just a nuclear failure, it was a lesson in how silence can be more toxic than smoke. The UK plan to weaponize weather. Rain was once seen as a miracle. By the mid-20th century, it became something governments tried to control. In post-war Britain, scientists and military planners began exploring a radical idea, that weather itself could become a weapon. The goal wasn't lightning bolts or hurricanes, but something far subtler: rain on command. If they could make it pour over enemy territory, they could flood supply lines, ruin harvests, or simply cause chaos without firing a shot. It started innocently enough. In 1952, the UK launched Operation Cumulus, a cloud seeding experiment using aircraft to spray silver iodide into clouds. The hope was to trigger artificial rainfall. But shortly after one of these tests over southern England, disaster struck. A flash flood in the small town of Lynmouth killed 35 people and destroyed hundreds of homes. Locals began to whisper that the government had caused it. The military denied any link, but documents later showed the experiments had taken place days before the tragedy. Though officials insisted it was coincidence, the event cast a long shadow over weather modification research. Behind closed doors, however, the experiments continued, evolving into classified Cold War programs to study how cloud seeding might affect agriculture, radar systems, and potentially warfare. Decades later, when records were declassified, the truth became clear. The UK had indeed tried to manipulate weather on a national scale. It wasn't fantasy. It was science with dangerous ambitions. The notion of playing God with the sky faded from public view, but the legacy of those experiments lingers. Every time a storm feels strangely deliberate, people wonder if nature is still entirely natural.